turn to Sudan, a country whose civil war has become one of the most severe humanitarian crises in the world. And the deeper political trajectory is often overshadowed by the battlefield reporting, but there's much to discuss here.
Tahid, 15th of April, we woke up to sounds of gunfire and shelling in residential neighborhoods across Khartoum.
And I always look at these things from a risk point of view when walking around the city. You know, the military didn't impress me. It looked like it wouldn't take much for that to flare up and there to be some violent acts. Today we turn to Sudan, a country whose civil war has become one of the most severe humanitarian crises in the world. And the deeper political trajectory is often overshadowed by the battlefield reporting, but there's much to discuss here. I'm Dominic Bowen, and welcome to the International Risk Podcast, where we explore the risks that are shaping our world and the risks that are forcing global change. Since April 2023, Sudan's conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces have reshaped not only territorial control in Sudan, but the political economy, its institutions, and the social fabric that really underpin the fragile transition that Sudan was going through beforehand. More than 12 million people have been displaced since 2023, and 21 million people in Sudan face acute food insecurity. And, this is just part of the story. But beyond these staggering figures, there's a much more structural question, and that's what kind of state will emerge from this conflict and who ultimately is going to define the authority of this new state. And our guest today is Hamid Khalafallah. Hamid's a PhD researcher at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, where he's really looking at grassroots movements and the political transitions right across Africa. He's worked extensively in Sudan with international organisations on governance and development and Middle East policy. He's had a lot of involvement in different institutions right across Africa, and his research on participatory governance and democratization and citizen state engagement is really, really interesting. So, Hamid, welcome to the International Risk Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dominic.
Hamid, your family comes from Sudan, and I understand you were there when tensions flared in 2023. Can you tell us what happened and what it was like for you?
On the morning of a Saturday, end of Ramadan, very close to Eid, 15th of April, we woke up to sounds of gunfire and shelling in residential neighborhoods across Khartoum. It wasn't, a surprise per se, because we've been warning that tensions are rising for the past couple of weeks. Those of us, particularly who worked with, who are, political analysts, activists, and following the situation on the ground very closely and working with the international community. I used to work for an international organization, but had also a lot of engagements with diplomats all through. We've been warning that tensions are rising and more needs to be done to kind of end this tension between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary. That was dismissed and ignored completely. So we're not surprised per se when they were erupted on the 15th of April, but we were shocked at the scale it started with, and that it started from the very center of Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, where everything is centralized. Historically, you'd have wars happening in the quote-unquote peripheries of Sudan, where people would then flee to where services are in the center in Khartoum and so on. But this time, the very center was taken out in the very first few hours of the war. So that meant everyone would have to flee, but would also have to flee to places that don't have services, and would necessarily mean that a lot of people, if they can afford it, would have to flee abroad, overseas, or so on. And this is what my family and I did. We waited they were out, if you will, for about 6 weeks before we started making a very long, expensive, risky journey through borders and paying for visas as if we're going for tourism, because no one was opening their borders for Sudanese who were fleeing war, until we made it to Cairo.
And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that, because I mean, I was last in Khartoum in 2020, and there was so much excitement about the potential and the new government and young people being involved in government, and it was a really fantastic and vibrant city, and there was so much excitement. But when looking at the military, and I always look at these things from a risk point of view when walking around the city, the military didn't impress me. It looked like it wouldn't take much for that to flare up and there to be some violent acts. So can you tell us what it's like? You're aware that there's tensions. Obviously, Sudan has been a country that's been suffering from various types of civil war in parts of the country for decades and decades. But nevertheless, you're in Khartoum, you wake up on a Saturday morning and you hear explosions, and you said that you waited it out for 6 weeks. So can you tell us what that looked like? For many of our listeners that haven't lived and worked in conflict zones, it's hard to imagine. Many people just jumped in their cars and went to Port Sudan, but you tried waiting it out in your house and then left. What was that like? Was it risky? Had the soldiers left the capital? Were there many checkpoints? Can you talk to us about what that was like?
Yeah, and it was good that in your 2020 visit, you already saw the militarized life, how it was. It signaled something problematic and something that you shouldn't trust. Because we've been telling that to a lot of diplomats. They kept on trusting the military leaders over and over again. I think waiting it out was our probably coping mechanism to tell ourselves that this is temporary, this is not forever, this will end soon. There will be some sort of intervention, diplomatic intervention from the international community to de-escalate, to ensure that at least that level of violence is upended in suspended, and in cities where the fighting has moved to, and then we would go back to political negotiations, to figure out a way out of this. But that did not happen. Obviously, staying was very risky. A lot of houses around us were shelled. Some stray bullets made it to our backyard. We found the remnants of bullets in our garden. We found some walls cracked after we had an explosion, but it's only a small part of a missile that reached, and so on. So it was risky, and it was also getting more dangerous. And just a few hours after we left the house, we were informed by some neighbors that the rapid support forces troops had occupied our house as they were taking over the neighborhood and the city and so on. But meanwhile, we were waiting there. It was obviously a daily kind of struggle of figuring out where to get water, because running water was cut in the very first few hours. So we had to identify wells around the neighborhood where we could go and get some water. Getting food supplies was also a struggle. It was good that we had some stock, because of Ramadan is a period where people in Sudan in particular would bring everything in advance so that you don't have to move while you are fasting in Ramadan and so on. So we made use of that, and we had a lot of leftovers. But that starts to run out, and you start thinking about, okay, where will I get it? And will every trip going out to try to fetch water or try to get food supplies or so on be the last trip? Because you might run into some soldiers moving here and there, or you might be in the way of air bombing that is happening around you, or you get caught in the crossfire in any way or the other. So it was a daily struggle and a daily risk. But we made it out very early on, and it's crazy to me to think about how people continue to survive this for the past almost 3 years now, living through that stress and risk on a daily basis. But you see the struggle, but you also see the resilience, and you see the resistance of people, and how they have managed to organize and managed to keep each other alive at a time when the warring parties couldn't care less about human life, but also the international community, Western governments, global international human rights frameworks, and so on, have failed every test when it comes to valuing and protecting the Sudanese life.
Thanks for explaining that and giving us that insight into your story. I appreciate that, Hamid. And one of the things we talk about on the International Risk podcast is different cognitive biases and how this impacts our analysis and how we think, but even how we collect information. And of course, there's confirmation bias where people really favor information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs. There's anchoring bias where the initial information really sets an anchor that we find it hard to deviate from. Of course, there's availability heuristic, which is where the most recent or vivid events seem most likely. Shark attacks, terrorist attacks are the sort of example there. We've got hindsight bias, where events that seem predictable after they occur lead to this "I knew it all along." And there's self-serving bias, and there's sunk cost fallacy, and there's so many different types. But they all impact the way we analyze the past, but also how we analyze the future. So I wonder, you're now doing your PhD. You've obviously lived in Sudan, you've worked with international organizations, and you're now doing your PhD on related topics and really digging into this in great detail. How have your experiences shaped your biases and shaped how you interpret what's happening in Sudan today?
No, absolutely. It has shaped it massively. I mean, I adopt an activist researcher positionality where, I bring my activism into my research and embrace it, but also trying to approach it from a very reflexive kind of angle to ensure that I continue to practice reflexivity as part of my research and so on, but in a way that does not myself from the conversation, because, I think what gives our analysis more value is bringing ourselves into the way we analyze things and so on. And in that sense, I think being neutral or avoiding complete bias, I don't think it was ever realistic, but I don't think it's also necessary in that way. But also, I think think about subjectivity and so on is also quite important to make sure that we're not being blindsided and ignoring some other facts and realities. I think what the way my experience, I think being a member of Sudan's pro-democracy movement, and then experiencing the war, and then coming to pursue an academic degree, a PhD in a Western institution, and so on. I think it was quite a journey for me to try to reconcile these contradictions, and how everything that I kind of bring to the table is not necessarily what is the mainstream where I currently am, and so on. But I think it has just made me very covertly pro grassroots politics and grassroots groups, and this is how I approach my research, but also how I approach my advocacy with regards to Sudan and so on. It has radicalized me in a way that I only believe in bottom-up politics and in grassroots politics, and in the power of the people, as opposed to the power of systems or the power of regimes and so on. And this is something that I continue to embrace as I approach my research.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Hamid. And of course, much of the reporting that we see on Sudan focuses on which side controls what territory. And, we know that the Sudanese armed forces have regained significant areas, including Khartoum and central Sudan, while the rapid support forces dominate much of Darfur and the western regions. But territorial control really is only one dimension of power. It's a very easy one. We can physically see where soldiers are, where they're not. But it's just one aspect. And I wonder about the current political and military landscape and the economic power of the country, and what that reveals about deeper structures of authority beyond the battlefield. Are you able to talk to that?
Absolutely. So I think the focus on territorial control that we continue to see dominating, the discourse on Sudan and dominating media reporting and so on is problematic for so many reasons. It's very dehumanizing for the people on the ground who are experiencing these, battlefield shifts and change of territorial control, and how that affects. It's not just a matter of removing the RSF and having SAF, or removing SAF and having the RSF. People experience these, even, although people try to promote the shift from rapid support forces control to the Sudanese armed forces control as a more positive shift, and although there are positive sides to it, but that shift and the process throughout this, through which this shift happens, is very violent and is very aggressive and is very, devastating for civilians caught in the crossfire. But also the aftermath is quite difficult for them. So when the rapid support forces take over, or the Sudanese armed forces take over, they accuse almost everyone in that community for being, a collaborator with the other. warring party. Otherwise, they question how did you survive if you were not cooperating with them, and are you now spying on us? And that obviously puts you at risk of detention, puts you at risk of assassination, and so on. So these territorial shifts are very difficult and problematic, but also, when people endure life under control of one of the warring factions and so on, it takes time, but then they figure out their routes and channels, and figure out how to survive, where to get food, a lot of survival mechanisms that they need to think about and they need to establish. Once that warring party is out of the picture and now you have a new warring party coming in as a replacement, you have to figure out that survival strategy all from the beginning. These changes, are rather destabilizing than stabilizing, as I can see them in many ways. But also, the longer we allow the war to continue and conflict or the battleground to keep shifting and so on, it's destabilizing for people who have already experienced this, but it's also destabilizing for how we keep on seeing new front lines of fighting being established every day. Recent one being Blue Nile State on the Sudanese-Ethiopian borders, and the war keeps on expanding and making places that people thought of as relatively safe because there wasn't active fighting at the time, and so on, are now becoming increasingly unsafe. Also, obviously, these shifts also keep on disrupting supply chains, economic configurations that were in place, and so on. So, suffering just keeps on increasing, regardless of who takes control over which part.
Yeah, and I think that control is a really important concept. I mean, there's the concept of elite bargaining, and this is how power is often distributed: power, resources, access to states, institutions, and this is often the influential elites who shape these political settlements and the conflict dynamics. And from what I understand in Sudan, it was these pacts between the military, political, and economic actors that led to a lot of this violence and the allocation of the winnings from violence. I understand that the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces were actually fighting over how long integration should take, whether it should be 2 years or 10 years before the RSF was integrated into the Sudanese armed forces. And when these talks broke down, that led to the current shift. But of course, these shifts in and around Khartoum have been framed as strategic victories: access to the palace and access to the airport, allowing the government to come back from Port Sudan and head back to Khartoum just in January of this year. But I wonder about governance and consolidation of this governance, and if there's this continued reshaping of elite bargaining and what that actually means for the people on the ground.
Sure. So Sudan has historically been governed, particularly since the Bashir era, but even prior to that, through scholar Alex Duval describes as the political marketplace, where it's exactly this idea of elite bargains that control or shape the political landscape in terms of rent-seeking, clientelistic kind of approaches, and so on, where the ruling group would buy elites or engage in these elites bargains to support and sustain their political dominance, if you will. What this war has done is that it has entrenched this political marketplace logic, but even exacerbated by adding, a militarily kind of aspect to it, where it's also about having access to arms and having arms as means to having a voice and as means to having a political role in any way. Obviously, this also comes from a history of processes in Sudan that were on the logic of rewarding those who carry arms for their violence, where if you carry arms, you to the negotiating table and then have access to power in many ways. And that logic kept on brewing in many parts of the country. But what this war has done now is that it made it the only equation that works. If you pick up arms, you get into a deal with the rapid support forces or with the Sudanese armed forces, depending on where you are and so on, and that gives you access to power and gives you a promise of a political future, but also protects you today. Meanwhile, this war is happening, and the level of fragmentation amongst these groups is something that people keep on underestimating. They think we have two warring parties that are, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces paramilitary. That is not the reality on the ground. We have tens, if not hundreds, of different armed groups who have picked up arms for different tribal, political, ideological reasons, because of this is, the only currency that works in Sudan today, and then forged some very fragile, pragmatic alliances with either SAF or the RSF. And the minute the fighting between SAF and RSF poses, these alliances, or the cracks within these alliances gets exposed. So we've seen over the past few months the cracks within the SAF alliance in Khartoum, in Jazeera, in places that they took over and claim now from the RSF, but now they're fighting between them, and you see competition between these different factions. So these elite bargains that usually would hold longer, but even when they don't hold and they're fragile and they break off, they're less violent than they were. But today, the risk is that every time these elite bargains break off and don't work, the cost is very violent and is very costly in terms of human lives.
Yeah, extremely so. And I'd like to explore what you talked about, this access to arms and access to weapons, and how weapons are the only currency that actually works. But I'll just take a moment, Hamid, to remind our listeners that if you prefer to watch your podcasts, all of the International Risk podcast episodes are available on YouTube. So please do go to YouTube and watch, subscribe, and please do like our content. It really is critical for our success. Now, Hamed, there's been an argument that this war has really intensified long-standing patterns of exclusion and concentration, and I think that's sadly very common in many conflict zones. I'm wondering about whether this is a reversion back to the pre-conflict political economy, and listening to what you said, I'm wondering about the entrenched networks and how they're adapting to violence instead of being dismantled by the violence. If we're seeing these existing networks and power structures actually just picking up arms, and if it is, to me that seems like a really, really concerning future for Sudan.
It absolutely is, and it's not a concerning future for Sudan. It's a concerning future for the entire region, for the entire continent, and dare I say, for the entire world. Because what research shows us on arms proliferation is that once a network or a route for illegal, illicit arms smuggling is established, it rarely gets completely succeeded. In most cases, it gets rediverted to channeling to another country or to another group or to another illicit good. And what we've seen in Sudan is that obviously there have been routes for arms movement that were established a long way before the rapid support forces with very strong ties with you know part of the Chadian regime, particularly the president. He had also the rapid support forces having also a strong alliance with Haftar, the leader of southern Libya. Then we had the Sudanese armed forces with historical partnership with the Egyptian army and the Egyptian regime. So these kind of routes already exist. The RSF's reliance on the UAE financially back is even from before the war eruption and so on. But ever since the war erupted, the external networks and links even more entrenched, but also even more diversified. So each of the warring faction established new links, external actors, and these were very much links were very much an illustration of the current geopolitics that we see playing out of the region, and that also relied very much on existing tensions in other parts of the region. For instance, Eritrean tension, the Somaliland tension. All of these tensions were, part of how the new routes and new channels of smuggling arms into Sudan have developed. And now we see the UAE, Saudi, the Emirati Saudi rivalry kind of playing out in Sudan as well. But the danger of how this continues to, become deeper and more entrenched in Sudan and in the region is that Sudan connects the Horn of Africa with Northern Africa. It borders the Red Sea. It connects Red Sea, East Africa, Horn of Africa with the Sahel, with the Sahel having its own issues in Niger, in Mali, and so on. And Sudan becomes the piece of the puzzle that connects all of this wars, plural, together from Somalia all the way to Mali. And this is very soon going to be a regional war, but a regional war that is supported externally from other parts in the Gulf, and far beyond the Gulf. So it's very much an international war in the material sense, in terms of how arms are being fueled, how different causes are contributing to this, and so on. But very soon, I worry it's going to be an actual international war because of also tensions that we see arising elsewhere in the broader region.
Well, there's certainly a lot of international actors involved and interested. Of course, you've got the Gulf states, like you mentioned, Qatar, UAE, Saudi, and then you've got other actors like Turkey and Egypt now more interested. And then, of course, there's been the interest for a long time from Russian elites in some of the natural resources in Sudan. But at the same time as these international actors got their fingers involved in various projects and various activities, there's more talk about reconstruction and return and the encouragement of displaced populations moving back, especially to parts of Khartoum. But the reconstruction bills are massive. The aid distribution is minimal. Services are minimal. So I'm wondering about the risks that reconstruction actually poses to local communities, and whether we're just seeing international powers take advantage of Sudan, or whether you see this as a healthy involvement from foreign actors who want to see a healthy Sudan emerge from the rubble of this conflict.
It is very far from being a health intervention. Obviously, rehabilitation, reconstruction, rebuilding of Khartoum, of Sudan is essential, and we all want to see it happening. We all, I want my people to, go back to their lives and have access to services and to try to regain some of what they have lost in the war. But how this happens matters, and it matters enormously. Doing it now when the war is not over yet, and when we are thinking about let's rebuild Khartoum and reconstruct Khartoum, because the entire discourse is about Khartoum, we're signaling that other parts of the country do not matter, which is the logic that has governed the Sudan's post-colonial state for the past 70 years, and it's the logic that has produced wars in many parts of the country. One could say, including the current war in the country. So that's a very problematic logic. And also, it completely dismisses the fact that people are still suffering elsewhere from the actual war in different parts of. So what it does, it kind of cements the current de facto partition between SAF-controlled areas and RSF-controlled areas, and normalizes this idea of this is okay, this is the current situation, we'll just rebuild from where we are, which is very problematic. I'm not sure anyone is interested in yet, a very unstable partition and a very unstable new country in the region. The newest countries in the world are South Sudan and Eritrea. Internationalists are just in the neighborhood, and that is still something that people are trying to figure out how to deal with. So you don't need a new, landlocked small country that is struggling with its sister brother.
Yeah, no, I thought it was quite interesting. You mentioned youth and grassroots organizations. I mean, the US aid funding, US President Donald Trump in January 2025 ended State Department funding by July 2025. So all US assistance to Sudan was cut. And that was about 44% of Sudan's entire humanitarian funding. That included food security, nutrition, health, protection. Not only were about 5,500 US aid contracts ended, we saw emergency food kitchens across 1,100 sites closed. We saw 2.8 million people affected by food distributions ending. And of course, we spoke earlier about the famine that was already affecting 24.5 million people. The health services were lost for over 10 million beneficiaries. That includes people, seeking health with birth and parental control, but also gender-based violence. I understand that nearly 20,000 people were affected by that. But it also impacted things like resilience, youth empowerment, grassroots peace building that you spoke about. And this was complemented at the same time by the UK, Germany, Switzerland, also cutting aid at the exact same time. So I wonder if you can tell us about, when it comes to grassroots organizations, which have just been such a powerful force in Sudan since the removal of the Bashar regime. What does that mean for people on the ground today? Do you think there is still hope and possibility that youth organizations and grassroots peace building can actually be impactful in Sudan, or is it too early?
I mean, it's not necessarily that a question of whether they are be too impactful or not. I think at the moment they are the only actors on the ground. So it their effectiveness and their efficiency is very well proved in many ways. And you're right, they were deeply impacted by the suspension of US aid, which was one of the very few international organizations that tried to figure out their bureaucracy and their very complicated systems to support grassroots groups on the ground. Very few countries, very few international organizations have followed suit. It's important for more countries, more organizations to figure out a way to work with such grassroots groups. But in terms of their future and their role and so on, I think they have been single-handedly shouldering the humanitarian response on the ground and literally keeping people alive for almost 3 years with very little resources, with very little experience. But what's even more, shameful is they do that with lack of recognition and with lack of protection from the international community. The recognition part is improving slowly. They were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. They won a couple of international awards from Europe, from the UK, and so on. But that is not enough. Need to be recognized more, formally in global platforms and so on. But they also need to be protected the same way international humanitarian workers are protected when they work in conflict zones and so on. And their political kind of agency needs to be respected as actors on the ground who are diverse, who are political, who are Sudanese, locally led, grassroots led, and so on, and stop trying to put them into boxes that fits international organizations, countries, and so on.
Now, Hamid, I only spent a short time in Sudan, but I've got many happy memories from my time there. But I wonder, you will have a lot more happy memories than me. What's one thing you would like our listeners to really understand about Sudan, other than the war and the conflict and the famine that's going on there?
I think I was watching this screening of a Sudanese film a couple of days ago here in Manchester that is called Sudan Remembers, where a Moroccan, Tunisian, French director was in Khartoum filming the revolution and then following the lives of some of the activists who were part of the revolution, but then also filming their resistance against the military coup that took place in 2021, and then their struggle after the war erupted and their displacement and so on. And what has been, very touching for me was that you see all of that violence, all of these difficulties that people have went through, but you also see the resilience, the art, the songs, the poetry that was happening throughout this story. And I think that is very important when we think about Sudan and the war in Sudan. And I say when we think about it because globally we don't think about it that much. But when we think about it, is not to only see that side and think of us Sudanese people as victims who are suffering or so on. We are that in many ways, particularly people on the ground and so on. But we are also have agency, and we are architects of our futures. We are architects of our presence. We resist. We show resilience in ways are extraordinary, really. So I think humanizing our suffering, remember our art, our tradition, our resistance and our revolution, everything that makes us human is important when thinking about the war in Sudan and when speaking about the war in Sudan, to make sure that we get to preserve that for the day after.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today, Hamid.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, that was a really important conversation with Hamid Khalafallah, whose work on governance, grassroots movements, and political transition, I think, has really helped us understand Sudan beyond just the battlefield. And his insights remind us that the risks in Sudan are not just defined by territorial control, but also by contested authority, by institutional erosion, by displacement, and really by the long shadow of this unresolved conflict in Sudan. Today's episode was produced and coordinated by Katerina Mazzucchelli. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening to the International List podcast, and we'll speak again in the next couple of days.